The original business plan written in 1985 for the centre, I think, is something we've stayed true to. We exist to provide a dynamic and supportive environment for innovative, high potential firms in the Greater Cambridge region. But I have to do so in such a way that I make money for St John's College. And in that respect, I think we are quite different from a lot of European science parks. We are members of the European Business Network, which is the organization of places like ourselves across Europe. And when I go to an EBN conference and we're all talking about how we run our business, most of my confrères in Europe are amazed that we actually have to pay money over to the university rather than receiving money back. But such is the British way. And if I fast forward the story a little bit to today, having started with just that one building in the middle in 1987, an extension was put on in the early 90s that included a restaurant. And then roughly speaking, it's as if every 5 years, another building has gone up on what had been this broken down farmland. So that now it is a mini science park in its own right. I've indulged myself a little bit with two photos in the top of the slide there, because I keep reminding my colleagues that although it's our responsibility to help the companies on site grow as much as they can, in many ways the Innovation Centre is a bit like a school, and we always have to remember that the success of the companies is down to them, just as it's down to the students to pass exams. We only provide the environment in which they can succeed. And last year, we had the Lord Lieutenant, Julie Spence, come to present the Queen's Award for Enterprise to 2 companies on site. And that isn't unusual in the St John's Innovation Centre. So despite our relative longevity, which might make you think we're no longer quite as innovative as we should be, we still seem to be doing something right. Over the next dozen years or so, the master plan for the Innovation Park is that it will double in size, using basically the same footprint. So the amount of built-on space will stay the same, but it will double in height. And it's a long drawn-out process for all sorts of reasons. And trying to estimate quite what people will want 10 years from now is very difficult. It's a job that uses up a fair bit of my working hours at the moment, trying to envisage both the concept and some of the detail of what a replacement innovation centre will look like. And I hope that as we can all start travelling again, one of the things I will be doing in March, April, May will be visiting other innovation centres, whether it's in the UK, in Berlin, in Paris, to come back with ideas about what we can do for our replacement centre. And I want to use that as the springboard for introducing the phenomenon itself. Why do people move here? Why do we get so many visits? Why over the years have I had presentations translated into many different languages? It's because if people were initially attracted to Cambridge because of its picture postcard quality, these days it genuinely has that rare thing, innovation. It has that ability to turn ideas back into practical reality, things that could be anything from a drug to a piece of software to a medical device to a game that has value in people's lives. And it is a rare thing. The Cambridge phenomenon itself has been studied quite comprehensively. As far as I can make out, and in discussions with Matthew Bullock, who was one of the founders of the phenomenon going back to the 1970s, when he was the regional director of Barclays and responsible for having one of the very, very few banking units that would actually provide funds to technology firms. Matthew only recently retired as Master of St Edmunds College, so he's seen, as it were, both sides of the innovation street, the commercialization side and the research side. Matthew was one of the people who helped get the original Cambridge Phenomenon publication by Sequence Wicksteed out in 1985. And it's a tome I still refer back to try and understand how we got to where we are. But in the intervening years, there have been many other studies of it. So it's probably about time I said, what is the Cambridge phenomenon? we can start by trying to put a few numbers on it. The latest numbers that I can get, which are halfway reputable, come from the Cambridge Enterprise Annual Report for 2020, which came out in May 2021. So we've got 3 or 4 months to wait for the 21 numbers. But in approximate figures, the core of the phenomenal issue is that this tiny city of probably fewer than 130,000 people has produced more than 20 companies with realized values of over $1 billion each, and in several cases over 10 or over $20 billion. I think the key term there is realized values. In the office, we operate a swear box system, and I think I'm about to put a pound in it, because anybody in my team who uses the word unicorn has to put some money in the swear box. For those of you who read the financial pages, you'll know that a unicorn is one of the modish terms for an unquoted company which has had a valuation through a recent investment round of over $1 billion. And I think, like so many of the metrics that tend to be used for trying to measure the life of a cluster, a unicorn isn't much use because it's subject to the greater fool theory. You might put a very high valuation on an unquoted company or a company that hasn't been sold to a purchaser outright, simply in the hope that somebody else is going to pay even more later. The difference, I think, around Cambridge is that the realized values are the ones which matter. So many of these companies have floated on the stock exchange or been acquired. And it isn't that they're just the tip of the iceberg, because behind them, there are thousands of other knowledge firms employing tens of thousands of people with a preponderance in knowledge sectors, which is 2.5 times the UK average, with the highest patent rate in the UK, and with total revenues, which on their own, the small firms on their own, would be equivalent to one major listed company. The other remarkable thing for me, I think, is the relative balance, the distribution of sectors. If we'd been having this conversation 20 years ago in the early 2000s, undoubtedly, the great majority of companies would have been in IT and telecoms. With the fast growth of life sciences, healthcare in all their manifestations in the past 20 years, although the absolute numbers of life science companies are not the same as the IT companies, because there are more founded each year, because they employ more people, because of necessity they receive more venture capital, because they are so capital intensive. It wouldn't surprise me if we came back and had a similar conversation in 10 years' time, that those slices of the pie, IT and life sciences, would be about the same. But it is quite rare for tech clusters that you've got such an even balance of sectors. And I think that is one of the strengths of the Cambridge cluster. Let me take a step back and say, how did we get to where we are? Because in many ways, it was the opposite of foreordained. This was not the chronicle of a cluster foretold. And the engagement of Cambridge, not just with innovation, like turning research back into useful stuff, but in research itself, is relatively recent. The nominal foundation date of the university when it received its charter was the early 13th century. You could argue that for 500 years after that, there was really no outreach, no engagement with the outside world, no attempt to commercialize. And in many ways, the Cambridge University Press was not about disseminating knowledge, but it was a form of Reformation propaganda. And it really took until Prince Albert was Chancellor of the university in the mid-19th century for Cambridge to take science seriously. Prince Albert had studied at the University of Bonn. In the early 19th century, the German universities were the leading centers for science. Prince Albert was astonished, I think would be a polite phrase, that Cambridge did not do anything in the physical sciences. And it was at his instigation that the Cavendish laboratory, the physics laboratory, was founded. So that was only about 150 years ago. And despite that research function coming to Cambridge, there was still very, very little that could be regarded as anything to do with the commercialization or the impact framework, to use the modern jargon, of that research. And it took until the 1960s, with the foundation of Cambridge Consultants by a group of recent science graduates at the university, whose vision was to put the brains of Cambridge at disposal of the problems of industry, that the acute challenge of the future of Cambridge came onto the policymakers' map. The real issue there was that since the years immediately after the Second World War, with the Holford planning principles, Cambridge had been designated to remain, in effect, a rural backwater, a medieval university city. And the planning restrictions were so strict that it made it virtually impossible for commercial activity, even commercial activity which was directly related to research coming out of the university, to flourish. You couldn't put up a new commercial building. There were some wacky workarounds. One of my favorite examples was the company that produced valves for radios, which was able to acquire commercial premises in the centre of Cambridge by taking over what had previously been an undertaker's. And because that had been deemed a commercial premise, they could then start manufacturing valves there. But otherwise, by and large, commercial companies were chased away. And this reached a head in 1965 when IBM, probably at that stage the largest tech research company in the world, wanted to move its European research headquarters to Cambridge. It was turned down because of the Holford principles, at which point even Cambridge, in its pomp, went, whoops, we've made a mistake. And the breakthrough was appointing Sir Neville Mott, the Cavendish Professor of Physics, to lead a review of planning guidelines, which ultimately led to the publication of the Mott Review, a copy of which I have in my hand and which I reread this morning with great excitement and appreciation of how finely judged it was. Because to cut a long story short, what Sir Neville's committee recommended was that although Cambridge, of course, did not want to have smokestack industries, and the bête noire that was held up as this is what we want to avoid was Oxford with the motor car industry, Sir Neville astutely made the point that it would somehow be ethically wrong and a missed opportunity if collectively in Cambridge we stood in the way of using Cambridge research for the impact and betterment of society in general. And with the changes that that committee brought through, the Science Park was created in 1970. The vision of John Bradfield, later Sir John Bradfield, the senior bursar of Trinity, also of great longevity, as John only died recently as well, followed a few years later by the St John's Innovation Centre. And then, if we fast forward the story to today, what is extraordinary is if you think in the 1970s there'd been one science park and pretty much nothing else. On the board here, I've listed those venture capital and angel funds that are either indigenous to Cambridge or have a material presence here. So for instance, DGF Esprit has an office in Cambridgeshire. It is a big Californian fund, whereas the others, Amadeus, IQ, are very successful long-term Cambridge venture funds. One of the other oddities of the Cambridge phenomenon is the number of networking organizations that have been set up, particularly on a sectoral basis, completely voluntary. So probably one of the most recent has been Cambridge Clean Tech, which for obvious reasons is also going from strength to strength. And I take a little bit of pride in saying it was actually launched in the St John's Innovation Centre, although we weren't responsible for it. And if you think back to 1970, there was only the Cambridge Science Park. 1987, you'd added St John's Innovation Centre. On the board here, I've listed as many as I could do from the top of my head, the innovation centres, incubators, science parks that Cambridge is now host to. And interestingly, if I draw on some research I was involved in 2015 for Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, what I think has happened almost by accident in Cambridge is that we've managed to fill just about every square on the grid. So if you were a bunch of graduate students with a great idea, you could start at the bottom left-hand corner and do some training, go through a startup weekend, do a hackathon, as you raise money, as you succeed, there will always be around Cambridge the type of premises that you need to move in and move on and move up and eventually move out. And that has happened without any sense of central planning. I think before I come on to why is Cambridge different from elsewhere, and are there any more broad lessons that we could look at from a policy point of view, I do need to have a shout out to the Cambridge Angels. And if through the day job, I do quite a lot of work talking to places overseas about how can we have a tech cluster. One of the big projects I'm engaged in at the moment is for Bangkok in Thailand. And it just seems very strange to me that in the first lockdown, I wrote Thailand's innovation white paper, sitting at this desk, hardly able to leave my own house and never having visited Thailand. But I wrote it on the basis of what is it that I've seen around the world that seems to work. And one of the things, if you were a policymaker, if you were Aladdin and you'd only got the one wish, I'd say you've got a wish for active and engaged angels, because it's the people who've got the hands-on knowledge of having started from nothing, from just the idea, and produced a business which is then sold on at great value, and then who bring their time, their money, their energy, their contacts to the next generation. It's that, I think, that is going to be one of the secret ingredients that makes a cluster work. The other one, I think, is why do you get up in the morning? And again, thinking of the many visits we get from overseas delegations, I think one of the points that overseas visitors tend to major on is the research strength of the university. And of course that matters, but research strength on its own is not going to lead to innovation. And I'm convinced that there is something about the mission statement of Cambridge that is inscribed on the website of Cambridge Enterprise, the Technology Transfer Office, that one way or another has permeated the rest of the cluster. And that is that what collectively we want to do is to contribute to society through research and innovation and everything else. It isn't just that we want to succeed for reasons of ego or material gain. And that leads me on to the slightly complicated role that the university plays in the whole Cambridge cluster. And I apologize for how busy this slide is, but I thought it was important to get some key numbers in front of you. The first one is that, to the great surprise of most overseas visitors and most government ministers who come to the Innovation Centre, the tech transfer function in Cambridge is not a factory that produces lots and lots of spin-outs every year. Probably on average, there might be 15, 16, maybe 20 companies that the funds set up by the university invest in companies that have been set up to commercialize university research. That is a tiny number compared with the many thousands of companies that there are in the Cambridge cluster each year. So it isn't that the university, through its tech transfer office, is a machine for new business, but Cambridge as a whole is a machine for new ideas. And it is a territory which is fertile in all the ingredients you need, whether it's experienced entrepreneurs, whether it's investors, whether it's the right type of space that people can move into. And I think the other absolutely key distinction is the extent to which, in general, not always and everywhere, and I have come across some painful exceptions to this, it is remarkable the extent to which distinguished academics are also active in entrepreneurship. For instance, Andy Hopper, who until recently was head of the computer lab, once said to me over dinner that if one of his PhD students wasn't involved in a startup, he would say, "What's the matter with you?" And I think that is the difference here compared with many other universities that I visited. And to give a specific example of that, I think it's quite remarkable that the same research area in the laboratory of molecular biology, going right back to the 1980s, in monoclonal antibodies, led to one Nobel Prize for Cesar Milstein back then, more recently for Sir Greg Winter. And that work also led to the development of one of the biggest selling drugs ever, Humira, So a Nobel-winning science has led to one of the biggest ever drugs, which has had a big impact on people's lives and which has also been a commercial success. And I think there's probably another sub-lesson there, which is looking at various recent government publications about the future of the UK economy. Government periodically becomes obsessed with the idea of research which is close to market. I would argue that you can never second guess what is going to be close to market. And unless you carry on doing the blue skies, the curiosity-driven research, you won't be developing those big ideas which will actually change the world. So in my last section, I'd then like to move on to where do I think we're going from here? Because if you stop the clock a couple of years ago, everything looks like a fairy tale, but I think things are getting a little bit darker and a little bit more difficult. One of which big issues comes down to this, that collectively, those of us, the anoraks who play in the Cambridge innovation scene, for quite a few years used to favour the metaphor of the rainforest as why ecosystems succeed. And a lot of this was taken from some work done by Huang and Horowitz studying Silicon Valley about 10 years ago, whose insight was that those innovation clusters that succeed best are not those which are run like a plantation or like a factory. It isn't the serried ranks of trees. It's more like the chaotic rainforest, which is very fertile, which keeps producing surprises. And it's out of that unpredictability, that serendipity, that great new ideas emerge. And certainly, personally, I have no argument with that. I think the values that Huang and Horowitz talked about, and which are ones which you would probably hear discussed at just about any innovation seminar if you were misguided enough to attend one. These are values which we talk about every day in the Innovation Centre. Things such as fail fast and persist, and above all, pay it forward. In other words, none of us who in the entrepreneurial world could ever really pay back the people who helped us get where we are. And the only way that we can recognize our debt is by doing the same for the next generation. So that part of the metaphor works. On the other hand, I think Cambridge has now become so complex, so large, and so tricky that we can't rely on the rainforest metaphor any longer. Another manifestation, I would say, of the current problem is it's almost as if every year another one of our success stories is sold, and almost invariably sold to an overseas corporation. Now, this is another area where government visitors and I almost get fisticuffs, because the idée reçue in policy circles is that this is fine. If a British company is bought by an American company, it's probably because the American company has got better management, better technology, better paths to market, and so on and so forth. I suspect those of you who've worked for big American corporations might be sucking your teeth at this moment, but that's what our government believes. And possibly, at least as importantly, when an acquisition is made, the controlling mind, the research and development, is likely to go overseas as well. For those of you who've been following the toing and froing of ARM in the tug of war between SoftBank, the regulators, NVIDIA, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, you've got a prize example of why current takeover policy doesn't work. So what's my vision for what might make things work? I'd start by saying we have to recognize what the problems are, and we have to have a bit of a vision. And the problems are that the bigger we've become, the less we can rely on people sorting their own little part of the forest, doing their own little part of the jigsaw. We've really got to the stage a few years ago where the growth of the tech sector had become such that it was becoming impossible for young academics to move to Cambridge because they couldn't afford to live here. It then got to the stage where even junior employees of highly paying tech companies couldn't afford to move to Cambridge. And as most of you who perhaps live just outside the city but used to go into the city for work will know, transport was something which had ground to a halt in a way which I'd only previously seen in places like Route 128 in Silicon Valley, or indeed trying to get into Microsoft in Seattle early in the morning. So that had been a big problem, and collectively we weren't good at sorting it out. I think another related factor is that once you're seen as a success story, you're much more under the spotlight, you've got much more to lose. So we still like to think of ourselves as it were, the upstarts, the David challenging the Silicon Valley Goliath, but it's not really true. And if we are to rally around something for how do we get around the little local difficulties, how do we stop squabbling over the marginalia, the details, and look at the bigger picture, I think it would be through having a vision. And my vision would be to recognize that Cambridge is almost uniquely placed to contribute to society, to contribute to the world as a whole through the implementation of innovation. And that is something that really is worth giving up your evenings and weekends for. It isn't just a day job. If I move on from that vision, that very high level statement, what does it mean in practice? I've been inspired over the years by quite a lot of the writing of Jeff Mulgan. Jeff used to be head of research at Nesta. More recently, he moved to University College London. And part of his thesis is that when you try to examine innovation districts, you have to, first of all, separate construction from curation. So a lot of policy for innovation districts, a lot of what government spends its money on is trying to create a district in the first place. Let's whack in a science park and let's pump prime a venture capital fund. Let's organize a conference, job done, move on. But it isn't like that. It's a long haul. It will take at least 10 years before you see any results. And once you've started to be big and successful, you have to put as much money into, as it were, the maintenance, the curation side, as you did on the initial creation side. Another aspect is that just about every successful innovation district in the world ends up with real estate problems. And that's something we could talk about in the Q&A session. I think around Cambridge, part of the problem is the extent to which within the city itself, and in many ways far beyond, almost all the land is owned either by the colleges or the university. So to expand, you have to move outside, as it were, outside the beltway. And that has implications for housing, for public transport and so forth, which we don't have the local government mechanisms to resolve. And finally, a particular bugbear of mine is, I think Cambridge in particular, but many innovation districts, love telling you how wonderful they are. And the thing that is the first sign of madness is believing your own propaganda. Because if you do that, you don't have the wisdom to realize what your faults are and to rectify them before they become fatal. However, trying to look on the bright side, reasons to be cheerful. I think just recently, there has been much greater engagement by the university itself in Cambridge's innovation district as opposed to simply Cambridge as a research area. Two manifestations of that would be the extent to which West Cambridge has been growing. And again, I was absolutely astonished rereading the Mott report this morning to find the extent to which West Cambridge was mentioned even then as the area where science and technology would expand. I also find when I visit the biomedical campus that it is breathtaking. This is like a second city. It didn't exist when I was an undergraduate. And more recently, the university, the health partnership has brought in a lot of strategic thinking for its long-term future. I'm very happy to talk when we come to Q&A of how more I think the university will become engaged. But just to give you a little bit of a mind map, I think the fundamental challenge we face collectively for the future of Cambridge is this: it is a very wicked problem. You've got all sorts of increasing complexities on several axes simultaneously, but our mindset has been we can just fiddle with one thing. Oh, we don't want to have increased public transport, or we don't want to move the sewage plant, or we don't want to encroach on the green belt. But we're not confronting the fact that this is a very wicked problem, not one to which you can simply say this far and no more. If we stop now, we are in effect halfway across the river, and it will be as difficult to go back, and in fact, we'll probably drown. I'm being a little bit provocative, I know there, but I'm going to finish, as so often in life, with an anecdote. And it takes me back to a previous life when I was responsible for underwriting the production of a book about Cambridge entrepreneurship in, I think, the year 2001, 2002. And very kindly, Alec Breurs, who was Vice Chancellor at the time, agreed to speak at the book launch in Heifers. And he talked about how he, with David Sainsbury, who at the time was Minister for Science, now the Chancellor of the University, had worked together with MIT to bring across many of the different programs, many of the different networks that had worked in Massachusetts as models for Cambridge. And I think in many ways, Alec Breurs was, as it were, the second founder of the phenomenon. When he'd finished speaking, he was asked a question to the effect of, how was it that he'd managed to bring about so much innovation in an institution which is as inherently conservative as the University of Cambridge? And Alec at that point told an anecdote. He said, well, my office is in the old schools. I look out over this wonderful lawn towards the Senate House. And in the summer, I hear the tour guides telling their visiting partners from Korea or Japan or America that the only way you can have a lawn as beautiful as this is to have had one which was laid down 500 years ago. And every year you have to mow it and seed it and roll it and feed it and mow it and seed it and roll it and feed it. And in his inimitable way, Alec Breurs said, but that's nonsense. Each year we put down new turf. And the lesson that I've learnt is that the only way you can bring about innovation is to make people think that it's continuity. And it's on that note that I'd like to finish. And I suppose that to the extent that I still have any professional working life left in me in the Innovation Centre, and to the extent that I carry on doing this kind of work when I retire and get much more involved in econometric research of how this happened, it would be to turn innovation into something that looks terribly, terribly like conservatism. So thank you very much.